Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another episode on the rise of startups in India. The year 2022 was full of highs and lows as far as the startup ecosystem is concerned. On the one hand, there was news about several startups getting recognized as unicorns, successful IPOs, and increase in the number of startups in India. However, on the other hand, we also heard of startups suffering losses, crashing stocks, and global economic conditions being unfavorable on the whole. In this regard, today we are going to discuss about what the strategy for startups should be to survive and thrive under these uncertain circumstances that we find ourselves amidst. Through the conversation, we are hoping to find some of the reasons why startups are unable to sustain their growth momentum, what are the reasons that lead to their failure, and some interventions that can help startups to grow. To discuss more about this, it's a pleasure to have with us here today Mr. Angira Agrawal, Global SVP, GTM and Strategy, Exotel. Angira, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me on, Supriya. It's a pleasure to connect and speak about startups today.
The pleasure is ours, absolutely, Angira. So let me tell you a little bit about Angira. Angira is an industry veteran with over 25 years of experience in both creating and scaling up businesses across different technologies. We also have with us Mr. Vikas Bhosle, the CEO of Crayon Software Experts. Hello, Vikas. Thank you so much for joining.
Hi, Supriya.
Hi.
Glad to be back again.
Absolutely. We are glad to have you here again. So Vikas is also an industry maestro, if I may say, with decades of experience in sales, marketing, business development, and client relationship management. So with this brief introduction, Angira, I'd like to come to you first. So like I was saying, Angira, startups, we hear that they've attained a certain funding, they've achieved a certain GMV, they're acquiring smaller companies, and suddenly we come to know that they're not doing so well anymore. So why do startups witness a growth decline after initially doing so well? And is strategy failure one of the reasons? Over to you, Angira.
Sure. Thanks, Supriya. That's an interesting question, actually. As startups start to scale up, I think, in my view, three elements come into play that fundamentally are a point of inflection where these startups need to relook how they're approaching the market. These 3 points are fundamentally, how are they scaling up? How are they building scale? That's one. The second one is about how they are engaging with customers and how are they gathering the voice of customer into the organization. And the third, also equally important, is about talent. How are they engaging with people? How are they building scale and how they are driving things forward, right? So when I look at the first point, what's happened in the last few years, and of course, there's been a lot of investment that's happened into startups, more so during the COVID times. There are about 100 unicorns that we hit in 2021. What's happened is that startups have started to get from the point of 0 to 1 to 1 to 10. And at that stage, what had worked for them in the past, they've started to struggle. So for an example, the thing that they really haven't factored in when they were going from 0 to 1 was processes, right? As you need to go bigger in size, your ability to build processes that make you independent of people become extremely important. In the initial stages, it's about the passion of the founders. They're involved in everything that they're doing. And as you grow larger, it's not about founders. It's about a larger team that is working with you to drive that forward. That becomes a challenge. And in the race to grow, startups often ignore the need for building up processes. So that's one that impacts from a scale viewpoint. Again, cost of customer acquisition. So initially you're throwing money in, you're spending money on marketing, you're spending money on acquiring customers. But as you grow larger, that cost is not sustainable. So how do you then redesign the organization to be able to acquire customers, but not at the same cost of customer acquisition? That's from a scalability viewpoint, right? The second piece that comes in is evolving market and customer needs. How does a startup grow? It grows because it's created some disruption in the market. However, there's always some startup a few steps behind them that's also going to disrupt their market, the space they have grown. There will also be, of course, a lot of Me Too's that will come in. So that space will fundamentally have, instead of 1 or 2, 5 or 10 startups that are operating in that space. When the disruption happens, being able to predict that, being able to work around that is something that startups often struggle with. So hearing the voice of the customer, understanding what is happening with the customer, At the 0 to 1 stage, the founders were very close to the customer and they were able to hear that. But when you grow large, how do you bring that feedback into the organization? That's something that becomes a challenge as they scale up. And the third piece is talent. So people who got you to a certain stage may not necessarily be the people who will take you to the next stage. And often it's very difficult to let go, right? So startups struggle with what is the right talent pool that is required to take us to the next stage. The second part that happens, by the way, a lot of early people who are the part of the founding team start leaving as some of the funding starts coming in and they realize there's enough opportunity for them. COVID's made us realize, hey, we can easily retire and we don't need to work as much from the big metro cities we used to work from. So that's also started to impact that people who had the passion, who had built the organization, start leaving. So a lot of knowledge goes out of the organization without it being transferred to the newer team that's come into place. So I think these three parameters, the ability to scale through processes, the ability to understand customers and be able to prepare yourself to be able to reach the next level, and the third is the right talent and people that are required to scale it up, are the primary reasons. Strategy cuts across all of these. But at the core, at an execution level, these are the three things that I believe significantly matter as the startup struggle to scale up.
Those were really pertinent points there, Angira. Thank you so much for that. And, you rightly mentioned about, building processes properly and, taking in taking into factor the scalability aspect and, the evolving customer needs. So, I'm sure there are also factors that point out to the fact that a startup is not doing so well. So, what are some of these things that, startups can take into consideration and, what are the factors that indicate that a startup is not able to withstand its initial growth?
That's a great question. So often, startups start by operating in a niche. And there's an opportunity, they're addressing a genuine customer need. Maybe it's latent, maybe it's overt, but there's a customer need that exists. As they start to grow, they need to identify if they're hitting saturation point in that market. Is that market really as large as it could be that they could scale up? And if they realize that, hey, the market need was 100 and they have already hit 50 or 60 or 70, there's only so much headroom to grow beyond that. So is the market really saturating? Is the demand really saturating? That's something that startups need to keep a close eye on. That's one. Secondly, is the cost of customer acquisition. Now, that is an easily measurable metric. If your cost of customer acquisition is going up and up because to get the attention of a customer, to get that customer on board is taking that much extra effort, it's not sustainable. Finally, there's a lifetime value that a customer gives you when they become part of your service, when they start using your services. If that lifetime value versus the cost of customer acquisition, that ratio is getting skewed, you are on a difficult path ahead, right? The third part is more and more intervention required from the top, right? And it's again easily measurable. How many escalations go to the top? Are those escalations, the way you're resolving them, are you fixing the process? Are you fixing the issue? If you're fixing the issue, they will continue to happen. But if you fix the process, it's a lot easier to manage, right? So it's again a metric to see how many times is shooting up to the top, how much time is being spent on an ongoing basis by the founding team to resolve those. It shows that, hey, there is a problem. There is something that's not working from the customer viewpoint, because of which the customers may start to move away, right? And the fourth metric is what was from the previous point is churn. Are customers starting to slow down? If you're the consumer business, is the MAU figure dropping? If that is happening, it's a clear leading indicator that business is going to struggle moving forward. And that's something that startups need to measure more actively.
That was a great viewpoint, Angira. Thank you so much for that. And with that, I'd like to come to you, Vikas. So Angira pointed out to all the factors that indicated startup is not able to sustain its initial growth and, that it's not doing so well. So to sort of avoid this trap of downward spiral, Vikas, what are the transformative steps that the startups should focus on?
Yeah, I think Angira has covered it very succinctly. He's pointed out everything that, whether it's a startup or a large enterprise, the things that you need to look are essentially the same. They get accentuated in the case of a startup because they work with slightly lesser resources than large enterprises, right? So it essentially goes down to, do you have a right need? Do you have the right money? Do you have the right team? Which is what he has already spoken, right? The thing that happens is, one of the things that, apart from what Angira has been saying, is look at market research, right? Is there a real need for your product? Are there enough Me Too's? Are there enough clones? Is there some kind of disruption that you are causing? Are you having scale in what you're trying to provide? And if the questions to some of these answers are in the negative, then you really need to start looking at, am I doing the right thing? Do I have the right product or a solution or a service, or am I causing enough amount of disruption? So I think that's one thing that one need to be very clear about. The other is finances. Most of the startups are bootstrapped initially. Founders come in, they put in their own money, they start to ramp up operations, and then of course they go to investors. And then when investors come in, and there is a need from the investors to see, I'm going to put in money. What is it that I'm going to get? And often many times investors say that if you are expecting me to put all the money without you putting in something from your own, then there are questions about the whole feasibility of the model. So, you need to be very clear about what you need to do. And I've said this earlier also. It's always good to have a scenario of your cash flow situation over 6 months, 1 year, 1.5 years, to see how really the finances are flowing. Okay. Then it's all about the team. And irrespective of what you do, which segment you serve, what solution you sell, and we may talk about chatbots and all these things that happen today, but eventually people sell to people. People love to hear from people. And it is eventually the talent on the ground that is the most important factor that makes a huge difference between your success and your failure. So getting the right people on board is important. With people, you get this whole point about the culture. And Angira spoke so beautifully about the process. It's the process, the people, the technology. And if this intervention and if this intersection is right, most of the time, you are in a happy space. A couple of other points that I would like to draw out is, one, you need to start to manage the risk. Right? And when I say manage the risk is, are you too heavily dependent on one customer? And I've seen a lot of startups, really rely on 80%, almost like 80-85% of their business coming from one large customer, which could be a large enterprise or a public sector enterprise. They would have one large investor who is a very jittery investor. They could be focusing on a set of people. We call it the consistency, right? You need to have a very consistent workforce who are all firing on all cylinders. But there's only one segment of your larger team which is really performing well. Then, you have a very heavy skew in your system. And those kind of risks have to be managed very, very carefully. And I think that I would put a lot of emphasis on. And finally, you need to have advocacy councils. Is your product doing well? What do you really need to look at? Right? Manage, do net promoter scores. Who are your promoters? Like Angira said, how many escalations go up to the top? How many can you manage? You need to have a customer success team that's constantly speaking to the customers, taking live and dynamic feedback from the marketplace and going and incorporating that back to make sure that your product and your service is concurrent with what the market needs. Because otherwise you're going to get disrupted, right? So eventually, when you really look at startups, is the fine balance between growth and profitability that one needs to straddle. And I think I would put a heavy emphasis, and behind that comes process, people, technology, churn, customer acquisition. And in my experience of having worked with startups, and we work with so many of them and ISVs, the one thing that they get super excited about is go to market. How can you help me get more customers? How can you help me reach other markets? It could be a global market. How can you do a partner to partner connect, or a customer roundtable, or a partner roundtable? Because what they're really hungry is customers. And I think that needs to be absolutely watertight.
That was a wonderful view, Vikas, on, you rightly mentioned about culture, people, and processes. There is a balance should be there between growth and profitability. And, a startup should have a great GTM. That was a great view. However, now let's come to the big T, which is technology. Technology, it's all over the place right now. And there is a certain amount of technology that every a business has to have. So what are some of the technology interventions and approaches that may enable startups to move swiftly into the growth orbit and help with swifter transitions?
Yeah. So just 2 points I'll bear out on this one. It's of course important that the other elements are also in place. In my opinion, the first thing that most startups should look at is how their stack is concurrent, right? I have seen a lot of really large, well-known unicorns in the market. We work with a few of them. And their stack that they had built at the start of their phase is exactly the stack that they are using now. Their customers have multiplied, their markets have multiplied. In fact, some of their offerings have multiplied, but the stack is the same. And it is becoming very slow. It does not have the agility. Even if you were to start doing some kind of refreshes or updates, the stack is not equipped to do that. And so there is this continuous need to look at your stack and see what kind of agility I can bring in with respect to technology. It could be containers, it could be Kubernetes. Do I need to serve the solution in a different way? Today we talk about SaaS, right? That's the most cost-effective and profitable way of serving your customers. I think one of the things in my experience is how are you keeping your overall technology stack super current? And I think as you start to grow and most startups start to grow, my assumption without having empirical data to support me based on the few things that I have been experienced and exposure to is that stack tends to become a little weak. And so one needs to go and fix that. The second is, this whole journey, and most startups will work on the cloud eventually. This whole piece today, and when you really look at even the economy, there's so much of now that focus on profitability. So one of the things is how do you take out cost and how do you make it much more cost effective? So there are ways and techniques and recommendations, suggestions in which you can make this entire life cycle of your journey on the cloud extremely cost effective. Techniques in modernizing your application, techniques in modernizing your infrastructure, looking at database. When do you switch on and switch off the VM? Do you move to a different to a different zone when it comes to data centers? There are tools that you can deploy, and n number of digital tools are available. So you need to find the right fit based on your people, your culture, how you are looking at your growth path. And these interventions needs to be ongoing, because what otherwise happens is, your bill just tends to get inflated out of control. And if you don't have this dynamic, and there are a lot of dynamic things which sit into your infrastructure, and they keep on giving live recommendations which can help you look at, what you say classically in the good old days, per seat costs and so on and so forth, because that's how it all operates. So I put these two things up front, and then everything else we have already spoken about.
That was a good point, Vikas. I mean, everything that you mentioned was great. And the takeaway for me was that, technological intervention has to be a constant process and not just a one-off sort of event. So with that, Angira, let me come to you. So Angira, there is so much that is being spoken about global economic conditions, and there are so many layoffs, and there is a talk of a recession that is coming into the market. So what do you foresee for the startup ecosystem in 2023, considering, all the headwinds like the global economic conditions?
Sure. So a couple of things that will start happening increasingly, right? For startups, it's extremely critical to hold on to their customers. The customers that they have, hold on to them. While there's always a need to go out and acquire more, multiple statistics indicate that acquiring a customer is so many times more, 3 times, 5 times more than retaining a customer. I think the thing that startups need to do is to hold on to those customers. And there are multiple ways they can do that. In fact, we did a survey a few weeks back, and interestingly, the survey was for marketing heads. But a lot of marketing heads came back and said that it's not right now about acquiring customers, it's about retaining customers. So a lot of their initiatives also are now focused on the existing customer base, existing consumer base, rather than acquiring new consumers. So that's a whole thing that is happening right now. And I think holding on to customers is extremely important. That's one point. The other point, a lot of VCs who have been funding these startups have gone out and raised funds. They have big money to spend, but they're keeping an eye out on profitability. Vikas touched upon profitability and the need that exists about building profitability. And that's obviously that everyone's talking about how startups' valuations have dropped because they're not profitable, how things are moving back to basics, where startups are now seeing how is it that they can also demonstrate, if not profitability, a path to profitability, right? And that's something they're being measured on. The first point, holding on to customers, will drive them towards the goal of profitability much faster. And as the VCs start seeing that, I'm sure if they notice that the organization is being prudent, they have a long runway in terms of the cash burn over the next few months or years, they will start investing again. They will start opening up the purse strings, and there'll be more money that will put in. The third piece is what Vikas pointed out, tech. The ability to serve this consumer base, customer base that they already have requires a refresh of tech or adapting it to a manner. It may be a one-time investment. If it's cloud, it's a recurring investment, but it can result in better automation, and their cost to serve can be much more effective than what it used to be in the past. So that's something that startups need to look at very actively. The ones that don't will have their valuations fall dramatically, hopefully not, but they will fall, or there'll be a consolidation that will happen in the market. More and more mergers will start happening. Some of the Me Too's that were there will start coming together to hopefully create a better value proposition, but definitely build scale in the process by coming together as organizations. And I think that's the other piece that will very actively start happening in the next few years. 2023, definitely, these are the things that will happen. People will start holding on to the customers. They will look at investing in tech to reduce their cost of serving customers. And mergers and acquisitions is something that we'll start seeing more and more of.
That was a great, point, Angira, especially the one that you mentioned on, startups being able to retain old customers as, they acquire newer customers. That was a great point there. Thank you so much for that. So Vikas, with that, I'll come to you. I mean, startups have the capability to contribute to about 4 or 5% of India's GDP. So how should startups move forward, under current circumstances to make sure that they continue contributing to India's economy?
Yeah. And, in all my recent talk, this is something that I say, that we should be proud to be Indians, and we should be proud to be in a land called India. Because irrespective of what's happening in the global economy, we are an absolute outlier, right? In the COVID times, we were the fastest growing GDP. We are projected and forecasted to be the fastest growing GDP in the next few years as well, right? So from being 10th when it comes to the pecking order in the number of countries in terms of the size of the GDP, today we are at number 5 in a matter of a few years. So this entire environment and the ecosystem is absolutely ripe for startups to thrive in the country. The number of initiatives, the government is so focused on digital outcomes and the platforms that they are creating, whether it is Gati Shakti, Aadhaar, the trilogy, right? The Jandhan, the Aadhaar, the mobile, all of that thing that the government is encouraging is absolutely the right impetus for startups to grow within the country. But, I came across a great piece of statistics, which I thought was just fantastic. And this is not specifically to the startup ecosystem, but this is about the country as well. And that's where startups and, more importantly, ISVs are playing a key role. It was about the FDI that the country is attracting. Now, this FDI, in the last 12 to 18 months, that India has been able to attract, has come in from 162 countries. It has been impacting 61 sectors of the India market, and they have been attracted in 31 states and union territories, which means that this is an absolutely all-inclusive growth. And we speak about metros and the new Bharat and tier 2, tier 3 Mufassil towns and cities, and that's where the opportunity, right? That's real. And that's where I see so much of growth happening today. These ISVs that are mushrooming in Kanpur and Chandigarh and Lucknow and Cochin and Trivandrum and Surat and Baroda, and doing terrific amount of work really working on the digital infrastructure that the government is creating, whether it is in the space of education, healthcare, green tech, whether it is about hydrogen, whether it is about sustainability. Uh, we call it classically Industry 4.0 solution. Industry 4.0 solutions are vertical solutions that you are creating to address specific problems in the society. And any large enterprise of any size has to partner with some of the small startups or ISVs to create that Industry 4.0 solution. So really, if you look at the opportunity in this land called India, uh, given the statistics that we have and given the infrastructure, the road, the rails, the number of registered startup, which is almost 85,000 now. If you look at 40% of the digital payments across the globe happening in India, I mean, whichever lens you look at it from, whether you look at it from the fourth industrial revolution, which is all about digital transformation, or about the cost of profit, about the need for profitability, which means you need to have a lot of, all that we spoke about, or just land of India, this opportunity and people so hungry, right? We had the fastest 5G deployment across the globe is happening in India, right? If you really look at the digital infrastructure that we are building, I think this is, focusing on very specific challenges that this country is facing in all of the sectors and segments of the market that I spoke about. The new Bharat that we speak about, this is the only way this country can go to the next level when you have this whole startup and the ISV ecosystem compete with the larger behemoths, whether the larger enterprise and technology as the democratizing force, creating a level playing field for everybody to compete and march forward. I would say this whole concept of New Bharat with with Industry 4.0 solution is the next big opportunity for all the startups.
That was a great view, Vikas. I mean, thank you for infusing a sense of patriotism into this conversation, which is needed at this point. I mean, you are absolutely right about the new Bharat, and you're absolutely right about, technology being the democratizing force. So with that, Angira, I'd like to come to you. Considering everything that we spoke about, what are your sort of final thoughts about the startups ecosystem in India? And, what are your final thoughts about what the future roadmap should be?
So, by the way, what Vikas said sparked off an interesting thought, and I was correlating back to multiple data points. We always think of startups as digital. But interestingly, what is happening, a lot of funding, a lot of startups are not necessarily in the visible to us as individual consumers space. There's a lot of work happening on startups which are not really digital. The only fact is that they're being funded, right? And that's how they're growing. If you look back, and I don't want to name brands here, but if you look back, there are companies that are in the beverages space. There are companies that are in the health food space. Agri-tech, green tech is, I think, what Vikas spoke about. There's a lot of work happening there that is making a fundamental impact at the grassroots level, right? And Vikas also spoke about infrastructure. Middle of last year, I drove from Bangalore to Delhi, right? And I was amazed at the impact that the infrastructure is going to make to the economy, right? People who needed to move to metros no longer need to do that. They can actually be sitting, let's say in Surat or Baroda, examples that Vikas touched upon. They could be sitting in Surat or Baroda and they could still serve markets like Mumbai, or maybe at some stage, markets like Delhi. That means they don't need to move to a metro, but that means there is better distribution of wealth at the ground level. And that's where the whole resurgence of the Indian economy can happen, right? And I think when those startups are operating at a different level, they are not necessarily digital, but they're making an impact. Is it dairy farming? Is it fundamentals like manufacturing of basic products? That's where the impact will come in. And I think startups need to encourage more and more people coming in, supporting them, helping them scale up. But there's a whole opportunity that exists, and I completely echo what Vikas said. There's a fantastic opportunity that exists for us as a country and for the whole startup ecosystem to mature and take the economy forward. Yes, there'll be failures, but that also builds up a lot of experience. People learn from that, and they come back with a different approach, with a more mature approach to how to drive the next startup forward. And that's what fundamentally made a difference, let's say, to the US a couple of decades ago. And you know what the Silicon Valley is about. But interestingly, if you were to compare India to the US, there are other parts of the US where it's not necessarily only digital. And that's where the difference comes in. So I think there's a huge opportunity waiting. And we should not always look at only digital. There's other opportunities also that exist.
Vikas, if I can now come to you for some final thoughts.
Yeah, I think I get a little patriotic at times. But then you really look at how the world has progressed. And we've started moving from farms to factories to offices. And today we are more or less hybrid, to Angira's point. You know, people can work from anywhere on their mobile or the laptop, get things done from. So that's clearly a big disruption that's happening. If you really look at the value creation, it's moved from land to capital to knowledge, to what is going to be automation and robotics and maybe hyper automation. That's what Gartner says. And so technology is going to be a big frontier, right? And that's going to really drive and propel everything forward, in my opinion. And it necessarily not digital, but technology is needed. And I think as long as there is a digital ecosystem or an ecosystem provided by the government, and you know that you have the right people, the right technology, and most importantly, you really look at always having that fine balance between growth and profitability and not sacrifice for one versus the other. I think this entire startup ecosystem is going to be one of the massive driving forces for our country, in my opinion, at least.
Thank you so much, Angira and Vikas. I must say, before coming into this conversation, I was not as optimistic, but now I'm just walking out with such an optimistic thought about the kind of opportunities that lie in India for the startup ecosystem. And Angira, there were really great insights from you from a startup viewpoint on people, processes, and culture. And Vikas, as usual, amazing views for you from you on the technology, from the technology perspective and the broader ecosystem perspective as well. It was a truly positive conversation. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us here today.
Thank you, Supriya, and great talking with you, Angira. It
Same here,
made up
Vikas.
my morning.
Great. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.